I'm Heather Long, an economics correspondent at the Washington Post, and I'm excited to be here today with the International Monetary Fund to discuss Chapter 3 of the World Economic Outlook. I'm joined today by economist John Bluedorn. Welcome, John, who is the author of Chapter 3, and it is now available on the IMF.org website. The formal title of Chapter 3, let me get this right, is Recession and Recoveries in Labor Markets. But really what this is about is what is on so many people's minds around the world, and that's jobs, jobs, jobs. We know we've lost millions of jobs during this crisis. We're in countries like the US or Europe, we're sort of halfway back, but certainly millions more people still need to find jobs. This chapter does a great overview of who's still hurting right now, how not just COVID, but automation is playing a big role in the pain and what we need to do going forward. And in particular, this chapter really outlines the pros and cons of different policy choices that lawmakers can make in different countries around the world going forward and make some recommendations. So John, let's dive right in. The first question I have for you is, so many people have dubbed this the K-shaped recovery, this notion that a lot of the high earners are in the jobs at the top have come back and didn't suffer very much, whereas a lot of low wage jobs at the bottom suffered greatly and still aren't back, and some sectors of the economy continue to lose jobs or go sideways, that sort of downside of the K. So my question for you is, sitting here in March, April 2021, which groups are still deeply impacted?
So thanks much, Heather. Yeah, the pandemic recession has really been unequal in its impacts. And in particular, we see youth, lower skilled individuals being really heavily impacted. And also women, particularly in emerging market economies, being hit quite hard on average. Some of that reflects the way that the pandemic shock has hit just different sectors of the economy unequally. So contact-intensive sectors, things like hotels and restaurants, accommodation and food, wholesale and retail trade, so like shopping, stores. These sectors have been hit particularly hard, and they also tend to have as workers more youth and lower skilled individuals. And that's one of the ways in which this pandemic recession, this pandemic shock, has really been unequal in its impacts across groups. But I would highlight those three in particular.
Yeah. And so my follow-up for you is, how concerned are you about scarring on these populations? We always worry in the economy about, can these people get back to work, or are you forecasting and really concerned that it could take years, similar to what we saw after the Great Recession?
I think on the kind of persistent effects of the pandemic on the economy. So there's one is kind of on the structure of the economy, and then is kind of on the kind of labor market prospects for these groups. It seems likely that there's going to be some persistent effects on the structure of the economy. So a move away from more contact-intensive activities, and that's actually also related to automation, in that often contact-intensive sectors tend to be more vulnerable to automation, and that's a trend that's kind of been there and is picked up probably as a result of has accelerated as a result of the pandemic. And so that's kind of one persistent effect. One thing that's been really good in terms of the labor market this time around is that we've seen used by policymakers a lot of what we refer to as job retention policies. So these are things like wage subsidies or short-time work schemes that enable people to remain attached to their jobs without, because the firm that they work at or the employer that they have is being hit really hard. And so without support, they might opt to just either shut down or let people go. But by keeping that connection alive, that match alive, kind of the fabric of the economy are these relationships. That's helping to forestall as large a rise in unemployment as we might have had. And consequently, the amount of scarring, as you mentioned, is probably could be less than it would have been in the absence of that kind of support. But it is certainly a concern that for those people who are made unemployed, we want them to be able to find jobs relatively quickly, because we know that long spells of unemployment lead to persistently worse kind of lifetime job prospects.
Yeah, yeah. You spend a lot of time in this chapter talking about automation. I think we've all been so focused on jobs lost from COVID, whether from people having to stay home, not go out as much. But as you just pointed out, automation is also playing a big role. Can you talk about what kind of jobs you think are being automated away right now?
So I think the automation trend is it's a little bit everywhere. But if I take as an example the sectors they mentioned, a couple of them that are being kind of particularly hard hit, like hotels and restaurants. One way that that's manifesting now as a result of the pandemic is we have now, for hotels, there's been a big uptake in contactless check-in, say, where you use your app to without seeing anybody, you just immediately use that to check in and then go to your room. Similarly, for restaurants, we've seen a big shift, of course, towards more takeout options and using kind of apps and stuff to make your orders and the like. Also, for shopping, there's been kind of more of a move, right, to kind of online options. These are actually they're not. It's not necessarily robots that we might think of taking over your job, but these are all signs of these automation kind of trends that are happening, and that's a trend that's been there, but it's perhaps been accelerated, as I mentioned, from the pandemic shock.
All right, you just used the word accelerated. That was going to be my next question for you. A lot of research has shown that usually automation does increase during recessions. And I'm wondering, due to the nature and the unique nature of this pandemic, do you think that automation is accelerating even more in this time?
Yeah, what we see seems to be kind of similar to what we've seen in past recessions. That said, in terms of the broad pattern, this acceleration and automation, the specific sectors that are being more impacted is a little different. In the past, we've seen more kind of manufacturing, more kind of construction, these kind of sectors being hit harder in recessions. So the relative drop that we see in employment growth for like hotels and restaurants and wholesale and retail trade is a little different. So although the broad pattern is similar in terms of this acceleration of automation trends, the specifics are a little different. And that's kind of interacting with kind of the nature, who's employed in these sectors, that kind of thing, impacting youth and lower skilled workers in particular.
Yeah. So let's turn to the solution side. A lot of this paper debates, job retention policies that you were speaking of earlier that are often used frequently in parts of Europe, in other parts of the world, to sort of keep workers in their current job, even if they have to reduce their hours or do kind of a part-time scheme. And on the other hand, the job reallocation policies, which has typically been something more at use in the United States, where people do get laid off and lose their job, but they are paid an unemployment sort of money to keep them going. And then there's hopefully programs or opportunities to transition them to a new job, either a different type of job at that hotel. Maybe they already used to be at that check-in, like you were saying, and now they can do a different job, or maybe they move to a different sector altogether. So I'm wondering, can you kind of run us through the pros and cons of job retention policy, like the European style, versus job reallocation policy, like what has traditionally been more the US model?
Yes. So one of the other things we study in the chapter is a phenomenon called occupational switches. And what that is exactly what you're talking about, Heather, which is when somebody has a particular kind of job, but then they move to a totally new kind of job or occupation. And what we see is that when people people do these occupational switches. If they happen on the job, they tend to actually see an earnings increase. But if they actually happen after they've had an unemployment spell that's been a longer one, like say 12 months or the like, then people tend to actually see a big earnings cut. And so that speaks to that there may be a difference in terms of the consequences, how reallocation happens. So if I reallocate while I'm still employed, then the likelihood is that I'm going to be able to kind of maintain earnings or actually see an increase. If I moved or reallocated to a totally new occupation, but only after I've experienced this unemployment spell, that's probably a sign that I'm kind of being forced to switch. And we see, like a 15% average earnings loss in those cases. And that's something
Yeah, I
that's
want to pause on that because I thought that was one of the most telling findings in this chapter. That I think the stat is if someone is unemployed for 12 months, then on average you were seeing a 15% decline if they switched into a new job. So they're taking a 15% pay cut, which is substantial for a lot of people,
yes.
particularly when we're talking about low-wage workers. And obviously, sitting here today, the end of March 2021, quite a few people have now been out of work. We've been in this situation for a year now. So we're getting to that 12-month mark for a lot of people.
Yeah, and it's also the case that once you've had that kind of that unemployment spell, the likelihood that you're going to need to switch occupations is also a lot higher. You're about a 50% chance that you're going to actually switch to a totally new kind of job. And that's different than if you're able to do it on the job. As I was saying, on the job switches tend to be earnings increasing. If you're actually going through an unemployment spell, then tends to see that drop. And I want to highlight also, you'd mentioned, yeah, particularly for lower skilled individuals, that's potentially a big hit. And what we see is that lower skilled individuals kind of get a triple whammy in these kind of circumstances with the pandemic, in that they tend to be employed in sectors that are more exposed to the pandemic shock. They also tend to, in recessions, they tend to be more likely to be laid off. And then when they are able to get reemployed, they're going to tend to need to, switch occupations and suffer an earnings loss.
Yeah.
And so, what if there are things that policies can do to kind of forestall some of those, or kind of dampen or mitigate that triple whammy? Then that's going to be a positive thing that we want to try to aim for.
So what should policymakers be doing right now, given what you've seen in your research? Countries, politicians, when you listen, they want to help. Businesses want to help. But what do you think would be the ideal focus right now?
So, as I mentioned earlier, the job retention policies that have been deployed have been extremely important in trying to keep a lid on the unemployment. And that's been a really good thing. And in fact, they've tended to those policies tend to benefit actually lower skilled workers more. And that's something that's been a real positive. As we're gonna be shifting though. There's a question: when do you kind of stop doing that kind of support and shift to try to adapt to the potentially longer term consequences of the pandemic shock? And that's something we got to kind of monitor. How is the pandemic unfolding? What's vaccination rollout look like? Because as the pandemic subsides, then we start moving into kind of more normal recovery. And that's where reallocation policies are going to be important to help facilitate the move of people and reemploy people who've become unemployed. And those are going to be things like hiring and startup incentives. There's going to be things like retraining. Of course, retraining is not a quick fix. That's really something that usually is going to take a while, but we do see kind of over the medium term big benefits in terms of job prospects for people who've undergone retraining because it's enhanced their human capital, their productivity.
Well, thank you so much. The chapter really has a lot of rich insights, particularly around job retention policies and how beneficial they were in the past year, and now this shift of focus, as John's just explained, to job reallocation as we begin to hopefully come out of this crisis around the world. Thank you so much, John. Again, economist John Bluedorn from the IMF, author of Chapter 3 on labor markets around the world. It is now available on imf.org. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Heather.